Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for those of you who are joining. We're going to give it a couple of minutes and let folks join. I'm going to get my screen all sorted and then we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Norm, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Perfect. All right, well, we'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started.
Okay.
All right, Norm, you ready to dig in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. My name's Audrey Ellis. Excited to see you all on the line and share Norm with you all today. I'm very excited for this conversation. So we are here today to chat on webinar 4 out of our 5-part series, a little bit about some of the more nuanced technical, financial, administrative complexities that come with AI and the decisions that we want to encourage institutions to think about as they are entering into the space or engaging in the space. So first wanted to take an opportunity to introduce my colleague, Norm Palmer from Complete College America. We're so thrilled that he's here. And Norm, I wanted to hand it over to you if you wouldn't mind giving a quick overview of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Audrey. I really appreciate you all having me today and being able to share a bit on policy and governance. Um, yeah, been here at Complete College America for about 6 months now. Massive learning curve for me because I come from the federal space and military and the defense space. So this has been a learning curve with regards to how higher education does its business and operates from a technical standpoint. But it's been a great experience. It's been full of learning, and I'm glad to be here today and look forward to sharing with everybody that's here.
Thank you. And I think your learning curve is fast but important and brings a different perspective to this moment right now because unlike a lot of institutions in higher ed, the military space especially has been dealing with decisions around policy and governance around AI for a long time, and you've been at the fore of those conversations. So I'm excited to chat about kind of what you can bring to this conversation, both with what you're learning in the higher ed space through CCA, but also based on your decades of experience in industry.
Thank you.
So just a couple of administrative notes. If you have any questions around our conversation, we would welcome you to drop those questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to address them as we go. But we also have time at the end for Q&A. We're recording the session today, so we will be sharing out the recording link with everyone who registered, and this video will be available on YouTube and on our website later to share around. And our hope is that this remains a real discussion, a little bit more of like a fireside chat style for this session than some of our past presentations. AI and policy are exciting topics, but we want to keep it interesting for you all. And before we dig in, I want to hand it over to Norm to talk a little bit about what CCA is doing around AI.
Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey. Ongoing, we've had our AI council now for several years. We're continuing that work, and it's it focuses on 15 members that are across multiple institutions. Academic success and ethics expertise are a part of the conversations that we have there. We have in June, the end of June, we have a CCA AI summit that's going to take place. We're looking at 25 alliance institutions. It's an unconference, so it's going to be unique. This is something that we've never done before. I'm really excited about it, and definitely hope to see those institutions there that wish to be a part of it. So really excited about that. We're currently in the development of comprehensive logic models for all of the work that we're doing at CCA that aligns to our pillars and to our strategies, really to simplify the implementation of artificial intelligence across our portfolio and body of work. So we're covering everything from uh, ethical guidelines, training, design, policy, and advocacy, and also the implementation support that's required. So the logic models will be forthcoming. We're kind of finalizing some of those now and really excited about getting those out. And then also, our big focus is AI policy and CCA University. So, our policy agenda at the federal and state level is really the focus on post-secondary education, its implementation, guardrails, ethical implementation, and use. And then also the implementation of our CCA University, our micro-credentialing and upskilling for institutional leaders as part of the overall CCA University that we're building out at CCA. And that's been underway for several months now. So really excited about that. And we have a really exciting person that's leading that, Sean. Sean has been with us now for almost the same time I've been at CCA. He's doing a dynamic job in building out those courses. So we're really excited about getting that out to the public.
Amazing. Well, today, like I said, we're in part four of our five-part webinar series. And as I reflect, it's funny, I don't have the slide handy, but I'm sure I was intentional 6 or 7 months ago when I made this webinar series. But looking at this order of what we've discussed over the last now 5 months, it really syncs up with exactly what we are recommending institutions consider when they are moving into the AI space, and also in the order that we recommend. So starting with the vision, like why are you engaging in AI and how does it fulfill and support your institutional mission and goals? Leaning into diagnosing where you are and assessing before you kind of dive into spending, building capacity through training and different types of models, and then thinking really critically about your governance and your policy approach to AI adoption, and then thinking about how to lead sustainable change, which will be our fifth webinar topic. So, really excited to dig into today's conversation, which is about four goals that we want to leave you all with. We want to talk today about what we're seeing with institutions that we work with and that we've studied as part of our AI for institutional transformation research around their approach to AI governance and AI strategy. We want to really differentiate between governance and policy. They're both important and they're related, but not synonymous. We want to talk about what it means and what we would encourage you to consider as you are doing your homework, if you will, before getting into relationships with AI vendors, making big decisions about your AI strategy. And then we want to encourage you to think about how you can kind of take the reins in your vendor relationships at your institution. So let's get into it. Um, I wanted to start by asking if folks could put in the chat um, the closest match to where you are as an institution. So if you are at an institution right now, or if you're at a nonprofit or really any organization, could you please put in the chat your response to this question, where your institution is today? Have you drafted an AI policy? Have you stood up an AI council or committee? Both or neither? So hopefully folks can drop into the chat if they are resonating with one of these bullet points here on our little poll. Do you feel at your institution or your organization, have you drafted an AI policy? Have you stood up an AI council or committee? Both. Thanks, Norm, for kicking us off.
Absolutely.
Neither yet. All right. Well, while folks are responding to that, I would say that to me, I would expect to see a lot of folks who are in one or the other. And thanks, Cynthia. Apologies that you can only post to the hosts and panelists, but we can see your comment. If others are having that issue, we can look into that. But in the meantime, I appreciate it if you can drop it in anywhere. Um, so yeah, it looks like Cynthia's org has drafted an AI policy. And I would say, from what we saw in our research, this is where a lot of institutions start. Certainly, the pattern that we are seeing is that um, most institutions, especially those that are in some form of adoption, are doing one of these two things. Some way to feel, if you will, like they've checked the box of AI, either by setting up a committee or a task force or assigning setting up a institutional policy around AI. And we often see that institutions feel that they're kind of stuck with their AI momentum or strategy around or at this point because it's almost as if the burden of the AI strategy falls on the policy itself rather than a strategy that leverages or aligns with a policy that the institution has. And so we want to kind of introduce some questions that Norm and I are going to talk through and just discuss here about what exactly institutions what we've seen in this research and as we work with institutions. And so I want to start by asking Norm if you could talk a little bit about when you work with an institution and hear that they have drafted an AI policy, what do you find yourself wanting to ask more from them before you read it?
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. What I generally will dive into off the rip is understanding what the mission of the institution is and how they're thinking about their policy aligning with that mission, right? So I think that it's essential, especially when you're talking about artificial intelligence and its integration into your IT ecosystem. And it's really just a part of the broader discussion around IT policies, right? And how they should align to the strategy and to the mission of the organization. When I think about policy, I think about strategy, right? It's a strategic intent. It is how the institution is driving or moving in a specific direction and trying to execute against specific strategic aims or goals that the institution may have. So when I think of policy, I think of that first, and I ask, have we thought through that process, right, prior to really delving into what that policy actually looks like? And then from there, I'll go in a bit into the framework itself and how it aligns to um, those specific goals that the institution has and how that policy is framed out. And then after that, we can go into governance and things of that nature for the execution.
When you talk about institutions or aligning policy with strategy. I think I want to unpack that a little bit more
Sure.
because in my experience working with institutions, a lot of times people think of like their board policy as, you know, the bucket that policy would fall under around AI. And in a lot of cases, that is more compliance based and less kind of a place that could even adapt quickly, for example, because board approval processes take months and running something through shared governance to then get approved by the board in that period of time that you change that you get that language through, you might find that what your needs are have shifted. So how do you like reconcile that with institutions, or how do you recommend they consider that dynamic between policy and strategy?
Yeah, strategy is the overarching concept of what the institution is driving towards. So the policy would be a segue into making actionable those strategic thoughts.
Mm,
How we move into the discussion of how we are going to operationalize, and the governance piece is the actual operationalizing of those thoughts.
mm,
So to make it plain, if I have to create a strategy, well, I have in some of my experience as a director in Washington. Um, those policies really are around anything that is going to create several things: transparency, um, efficiencies, whether they're financial, time savings, in which come into financials, or something that is in alignment with something that is mandatory from a compliance standpoint. So those policies are generally drafted and created such that they're able to keep the institution properly aligned.
mm,
And then after that, you look into how are we going to actually operationalize these policy guidelines that we had that the institution has set.
mm. Well, that's a good transition because our next section is about governance not being policy and maybe policy being part of a governance, but not the be all end all.
Mhm.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you envision good governance looking like at an institution that is doing AI governance well.
Well, I see it as, in my experience, federated governance is always important. And the way I see it is there are like five interlocking organizations or bodies of work that have to be aligned. Generally, when you're talking about instantiating or implementing governance, you would have some type of executive steering committee. So in this instance, it would probably be an AI steering committee
Mm,
that provides direction on how the strategy, the principles, risk decisions, so risk mitigation, funding and reports, how that all is a part of that executive steering committee's responsibility in creating that body of work for the
hmm
organization. And then an AI council of some sort to to actually implement the policy,
mm,
to perform all the risk reviews that have to occur in the varied streams of work that you have going, AI inventory to understand which LLMs you have in the environment. And then also from an institutional standpoint, your training coordination.
mm,
That's extremely important for your upskilling. I think that also you would have some domain working groups. If you have certain verticals in your organization, you would have this group would break out and have direct oversight on the implementation of artificial intelligence in those areas. Um, I think it's also important that you have a procurement review board. So um, basically reviewing contracts, your data repositories, and then also accessibility, ensuring that it is fair across the board. And then, of course, you would need an ethics group for your AI ethics and basically a high impact review to see what the actual impact of the implementation of artificial intelligence in the organization is having the institution. So, but that addresses rights, equity, and due process to
mm,
ensure that those activities are being observed and actually executed. And then lastly, on the security side, which I think is extremely important, is having an AI incident response team to address data leakage,
mm,
any harmful inputs or outputs that occurred based upon accidents and things of that nature. Um, and then vendor failure, I think, is
Mm,
also an important part of that AI response, incident response team. So if you're having problems with your vendors and meeting those SLAs or SLOs that you have in your environment, you can have a review of that.
yeah. I think what you're describing is exactly like you said. It's the way to take your strategy, your vision, which really should be at the core of everything that you do, plus your policy, and then put that into practice. So it's who has what authority to make decisions and who are they able to consult? How do decisions get reviewed? And then, I think just important context for everyone to recognize that AI isn't like a point in time decision. It is a new reality for our institutions, like data governance is. And I implemented data governance at my last institution, and it's not always like the easiest case to make for institutional leaders. It's not the sexiest topic, if I'm being honest. Like, let's build a governance structure for this thing that drives us nuts when it's not working, but it often isn't working. And when it doesn't work, we all pay the price. So taking the time, I think, to allocate the resources, build the muscle, and like exercise the muscle of governance is so important for successful long-term use of AI, not just like checking the box that we have done AI in this moment, which I think often creating or getting a policy approved can create a false sense of confidence. Like, okay, we did it. We're there. Or we got the report back from our task force. But a task force or a steering committee is really just like the tip of the iceberg of what governance involves. And it is both functional and technical. And it's about the marriage of the two and the way that those both sides of the house are working well together. I'd love to hear, Norm, if you were talking to a CFO, a CIO, a president who doesn't have a robust governance infrastructure in place right now around AI, where would you recommend that they start?
I would probably start, I would start with two things. First, I would start with finding an internal champion that would be interested in implementation of artificial intelligence in the ecosystem, the IT ecosystem. But that would be followed by first finding the champion. Then after that, I would really work on trying to um, have a discussion around what should our strategy be, right? Around um, creating both a policy and a sound governance structure to be implemented with our current ecosystem.
Mm.
Some of the community colleges that I've been doing some work with, they don't generally have much of an IT staff. So they're challenged in that regard. But what I have shared with those institutions is that if you take a step back, you find those internal champions within the staff, faculty, and the executive teams to help you to really amplify the message of one, security, because when you're adding significant attack vectors to an environment when you are adding agentic artificial intelligence. And that's another thing I think is really important, Audrey, is that institutions probably need some foundational understanding of the very types of AI. It's been
Hmm.
around for 50 plus years, been around for a very
Yep.
long time. But when we went from deep learning, machine learning, deep learning into transformers models and large language models, which are a form of transformers, um, there's a lot of change that goes with that, and because of that, it increases your security risk.
Hmm.
So, a CFO, they're always looking at the risk register and how to mitigate as many risks as they possibly can. So, I think that's an important discussion to have around risk, and also doing an analysis on the trade-offs of implementing certain types of AI in your environment and why. What are the use
Mhm.
cases that we want to address first, so that it makes sense for our institution to do this in certain areas initially
Mhm.
until we take a deep dive and just go all out, right?
Yeah.
So having those champions, I think, are important. And then that follows with understanding the risks and then how the institution may want to proceed based upon use case.
Yeah, if I could add a little bit of color from my experience working with institutions, I think I've seen a lot of scenarios where there's a lot of shadow AI adoption happening on campus because there is no governance in place and there is no strategy from the top, which is really what T3 and I think CCA have been advocating that institutions create and endeavor to build beyond just a policy. And so if you don't have that, that's not going to stop people from using it. It's just going to let people use AI unchecked.
Right.
And I think that means that whether or not you have a large IT staff or, you're a lean team, the first step is exactly what you said. It's a leadership
Yeah.
decision, and it is our like how are we going to lead our institution in this new reality that we live in? Who is going to be at the helm of that, and what does it look like for us to lead? And that includes technical facets like security and procurement and data and all of that, but it also does include sometimes just really difficult things around change management, which I know Norm and I have chatted about at length. Like I come from the space where you could have a platform be perfectly implemented technically, but that doesn't mean it's going to get adopted. And Norm, you come from the place of like, how can I get this implemented to eliminate the risk? And
Right.
both of those are risks, right? Like you could have no cybersecurity risk, but no one's using the tool. That's still a
Right.
risk to the institution. So
Yes.
this really needs to be both sides of the table coming to the conversation, and governance can be, and my opinion, I think yours too, Norm, is the
Hmm.
place for that conversation to live. And so that's the case I think we're trying to build.
Absolutely.
And I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about how you think about, let's get into this question deeper about specificity versus flexibility in policy language. I've had an interesting experience working with some institutions around this, and I'd love to hear where you think it's important for leaders to be prescriptive around data or around AI, and where you think they should kind of be more flexible.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to risk, right?
Yeah.
And what your institution can risk. Um, so for me, when I think about flexibility versus specificity, um, I always try to go in with policy at a high level first, and that is not to not encumber innovation and opportunity, right? First, based upon the vertical that you may be looking to implement that technology, then you may have to provide a little bit more specificity on what type of models that you want to implement, and then also what type of security and risk posture you want to take to address that. So if you're working in an area that is heavy PII, you want a lot of specificity there
Hmm.
because it puts into question FERPA and other you know law-based activities that are needed for compliance. The flexibility comes in areas where there's, in my estimation, there would be more exploratory activities taking place, more scientific, more experimentation, things of that nature. I would look to have more flexibility in my policy language to ensure that the institution is able to perform those experiments and to have a
Hmm.
level of flexibility such that the faculty, staff, and learners uh, have the capability to use different models in that space so that they can derive different outcomes. So I think those are two different approaches that institutions may want to look at when they're thinking about their approach to implementation of AI. The other thing I'm a real big proponent of. There are certain things that we don't need to inject risk So your transformers models inject a lot of risk because the API calls are persistent. They're always occurring, and there's a significant attack surface there that is provided to a lot of bad guys that may want to get into your institution, into your data stores. So I think that using some good narrow AI, it's a lot more predictable. It's easier to manage from a management perspective regarding tools to lock down those endpoints. So there's different approaches that you can take to addressing the flexibility and specificity conversation within your policy creation.
Yeah, and I think there's also something to be said for guidelines versus and like or value statements or guardrails statements versus board approved policy as higher ed knows it. And I'd be curious for your thoughts on like where you draw the line between something that should live in a guideline versus around, let's say, like individual use of AI versus IT specific policy around how you or like what the requirements are from a security standpoint. Because, for an end user or for the types of policies that what am I trying to say? How do you ensure that a policy stays relevant as, agentic AI was barely a blip in the commercial landscape a year ago?
Yeah.
What about the schools that spent the first 2 years of generative AI being available writing policies and now agentic AI, changes the landscape that they were trying to monitor?
I think it's twofold. I think that you have to look at what the state policies are. States are starting to develop policies. Currently, there's not a whole lot of policy at the federal level, but states are starting to form policy. So I would defer to what my state policy is first, and then after that, I would look at national requirements around compliance. And then after that, I would begin to develop my policy model at an institutional level, which addresses the mission, the alignment with the mission, the alignment with our risk register, and what is acceptable risk. And then
Mhm.
after that, I would look at how the institution wants to be either more specific or not. And also, I think that it's critical to look at the varied models
Mm,
that you're going to instantiate into your organization, implement into your organization. And if those are closed LLMs, if they're open LLMs, hopefully they're closed. And then also, I would have to look at what data clusters they're going to have access to.
mm,
So that's an important area of discussion as well as you're beginning to create your policy and whether it needs to be more specific or flexible.
mm. I'm going to skip us ahead briefly because I'm mindful of time, and I think you and I could wax poetic on this topic for quite a while. I want to talk a little bit about one of the resources that T3 developed in collaboration with CCA as part of our AI for Institutional Transformation study, which is a guide to considering some of the prerequisites for adopting AI. And if Daniel, if you could drop the link in the chat at some point when you have a moment. Um, Wanted to just kind of outline these three policies or these three prerequisites. And here again, if folks could also put in the chat which of these prerequisites you all feel your institution, which one you feel institutions most often underestimate. So if you could put in the chat one, two, or three, which one do you think your institution pays the least mind to? Data integrity, data security, or governance frameworks. Interesting. Data integrity. Thanks, Cynthia. You're a model student today. As always, I'm sure. Security. Well, interestingly enough, in our research, we found that of all of these, we felt that institutions were most often underestimating the governance component. We heard from institutions they knew and were kind of actually often hyper aware of the risks around data security. Even if they didn't have a mitigation strategy, they knew it existed, and were concerned about it. And if anyone's seen the news the last couple of weeks, I think we've had a perfect example of why or security is top of mind for everyone. And we also heard that folks knew that their data quality wasn't great, and there was a lot of comfort with the phrase garbage in, garbage out. Didn't mean they were necessarily committed to cleaning their data, but they were aware. And so that's part of why we're really making the case today for governance. But I do want to get into the data a little bit more too. And so I want to ask you, Norman, if you could talk a little bit about data. As I said, we hope that leaders are hoping that AI will help them understand this kind of like massive amount of data that we have had in higher ed for a long time. But often right now their data is not in a place that it could be easily leveraged in the way that I think our hopes and dreams are getting placed on AI. So I think I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit to how you would coach an institution to dealing with that. Like, would you tell them to wait 3 years and clean up their data before they work with AI?
It depends. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, there are some institutions that have a fairly robust or a robust data cleansing process to ensure that both their structured and unstructured data meet a certain level of requirement for their institution, right? Those institutions are readily capable of going into using transformers models because those models they're like children. You have to literally grow them. So what you feed them is what they're going to learn. And based upon your data sets that you're going to provide those models, they will begin to take on certain characteristics. Um, from a mathematical standpoint, the probabilities will show that information that you provide them will produce certain outcomes, right? So you want to make sure that your data you do have a data cleansing methodology in place to help your institution. Those institutions that don't have very good policies around their unstructured data, especially because that's generally where you have your problems. Your structured data is pretty straightforward, and those are all your databases. Those are your CRMs. Those are your the batching that takes place from your financials, your Z series, and all that type of stuff. So from a structural standpoint, generally that's not an issue. It's generally the unstructured data that are not utilizing clusters is where you have your problems with data. So you have to create that capability. I recommend you create some type of data cleansing processes for your institution. Whether you do it on a nightly, weekly, monthly time frame. But I think that having healthy data cleansing processes is essential to do that from a just a data hygiene standpoint is necessary. Um, but we at CCA, we've been doing that for quite some time, training and teaching institutions on how to go about cleaning their data, cleansing their data, going through it, and creating organizational structures such that they're able to use that data, once they go through that process. And it shouldn't take extremely long, depending on how many petabytes of data you may have. So having those processes in place are very important, I would say, before you begin to train a model. And it will ensure that your outcomes are more in alignment with what you're hoping to expect or that you want for your institution. If you don't go through those processes, as you stated, Audrey, it can be one of those scenarios where it's garbage in, garbage out, and it'll just do it extremely fast. So it's essential that institutions do implore that. The other thing I would like to mention is that um, the transformative models of AI are not a silver bullet. They just aren't. There are challenges with them. There's a lot that's going on with in a lot of these models where there's constant tweaks taking place still to ensure that the outcomes align with desired outcomes. So, you hear about a lot of new models coming out and things of that nature, and those things are addressing some of the challenges that those models may see with the data they are interfacing with.
Yeah, I think that for me, the takeaway is that there are a lot of ways, like I personally would not advise an institution to I think sometimes my instinct is like, yes, can we just put the world on pause and clean our data and nothing will change and then we can do AI. But obviously that is not the reality. And so in that, given that, I think there are lower, like high impact ways to use AI that don't always require a lot of data that could be happening simultaneously. While you are getting your ducks in a row from a data standpoint. So you could be focusing on operational efficiencies and specific use cases that are leveraging, your co-pilot that your institution has purchased or, figuring out ways to win back some time, let's say from busy work that will allow you to then spend some time in the back end cleaning up your data so that um, you're not waiting, but you're also not telling people that you're rolling out a tool that ultimately is going to be relying on poor quality data. And I think as you're evaluating vendors, which we'll talk about later, keep in mind like what do they need to know about your institution in order to deliver what they're showing you they can do. And so if their demo is really robust and it is showing you like highly nuanced interpretations of data, imagine that it is their demo data set that they are working off of, which is clean, most likely, whereas yours might not be a parallel or analogous to what they are working with. And so that's an important decision point as you're going into vendor conversations is what's the quality of data you're using in your demo platform versus the quality of data we have to work with right now at our at our college. And so again, I think Norm and I have a lot to talk about here. Um, let's take a minute on cybersecurity. This is really out of my domain, but I want to give Norm some time because it's important, critically important, especially as we've seen the last 2 weeks. So Norm, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing at institutions that are taking cybersecurity very seriously?
Yeah, everybody's looking for tools now and really endpoint protection. So those institutions that are looking at implementing transformer models, and I keep on saying that because there are differences in um, different types of AI.
Hmm.
But the Claude GP, the Claude AI, the Chat GPT, um, and the varied other models that are out there that really use the agentic and the generative AI, um, they require endpoint protection, a lot of it, because the attack vectors, because the API calls are so persistent, there is a need for really good endpoint protection to constantly monitor those endpoints, and it drives up cost. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Audrey.
Nope, I just want to make sure we're doing a little translation. I think we might have a
Sorry.
mix of technical and non-technical people, so I'll
Okay.
translate to layperson's terms and you can tell me if
Okay.
I'm right. This has been a fun other duties as assigned task in my career. So basically, with tools like agentic AI, like Claude, you have different tools talking to each other, which is what happens with an API. You have Claude talking to your, let's say, email or your banner implementation. The endpoint security is looking at both sides of that API and saying, what are the frequent like touch points or conversations that are happening via this tool, and are there risks, and monitoring, like, is there a huge spike? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what else they would monitor in layperson's
Yeah,
terms.
it's
Um,
okay. Sorry.
no,
Yeah,
go for it.
yeah, they have these things called threat hunting, threat hunters, and they help to identify vulnerabilities in your ecosystem. And then you definitely need a base um, operating system, um, you know, cybersecurity implementation to take place of your basic for your ecosystem. But then you also need this endpoint protection because the handshake that's taking place is where there's a there historically now there has always been an exploit with API calls, but especially now because of what is called a persistent threat is because it's constantly communicating. There's a constant handshake going on as your AI models are going out there, going out and having these conversations with these other tools or other operating systems that you may have in the environment. So it creates another layer of that could be exploited by bad actors.
Hmm.
So it's extremely important that institutions look at that, good endpoint protection, a good cybersecurity policy to ensure that your most critical infrastructure is guarded, your PII, any of your areas where you're doing transactions, SOC 2 compliance models, anything that comes into place of anything that is IP, intellectual property based. So if you're a research institution and you have intellectual property, you want to make sure that that you have good security there, and also threat monitoring, because a lot of that we're seeing in this space with those vulnerabilities, a lot of that is being exploited today. So it's really critical that institutions be mindful of that and make the investment up front.
Thank you. And one of the last parts we want to close out with is kind of taking control of your vendor relationships. And so, we have seen throughout our research that a lot of institutions right now, well, every institution, I think I had a president tell me the other day they get 5 to 10 emails from AI vendors a week right now. The market is flooding with AI platforms, and your existing platforms that you have on campus are layering AI into their functionality, or AI washing, as some people are calling it, to stay relevant, or at least appear to be staying relevant. And so going back to your point, Norm, not only is agentic AI in and of itself introducing new cybersecurity risks, just to like close out that thread, but the fact that every single vendor is trying to add AI into their own platforms just magnifies that risk significantly. And this isn't like entirely a doom and gloom webinar, I promise. We are trying to bring some light to these elements, especially for functional leaders, because this is so important for the functional success of this technology. So Norm, I want to ask you if you could, in just a couple of sentences, tell us what's the first question you would tell a leader to ask if they are being approached by an AI vendor? And is there also a question that vendors are hoping they don't get asked?
Oh, I'm sure. A lot of it, a lot of it is one of the first questions I personally ask is, what are your compliance models that you use inside your organization? Because it tells you their mindset. If you find an organization that's using SOC 2 compliance, ISO, ISO, they're generally decent organizations because there's a level of transparency that comes with that. And there's also a level of rigor that comes with that, with those two organizations, SOC 2, especially for transactional. And when I say transactional, I mean processing of money.
Mhm.
Those compliance models require a lot of rigor, but they're even challenged now. The ISO, the International Standards Organization, 27,000, I think it's 3750 or something like that, is the other that is used, or 3,500 are the series that are used for cybersecurity, both in data centers as well as in daily operations. So organizations that use those two models generally are pretty good when it comes to how they approach cybersecurity. So that's important. The other thing is understanding a little bit about the architecture and the framework that they're utilizing um, for their actual LLM that they may be, or AI type of solution that they're providing you. Understanding what that foundation is critical. What is it built upon? Um, and those are some more of the technical requirements, I think, that um, a lot of our institutions have to become more mindful of as they're looking at implementing artificial intelligence and understanding what the strengths and the weaknesses of those models are, addressing bias and things of that nature. Asking for a interpretability study, I think, is a mechanistic interpretability study from that vendor is important. If a vendor doesn't know what that is, that for me, that raises a red flag, especially if they're saying that they're doing artificial intelligence, because it's telling you if a vendor doesn't know that they're not identifying and mitigating bias in their code.
Mhm.
So those are things that are important. XAI is another that is also very important. Human in the loop capabilities. So if there is an issue where your model is having some challenges, you'll be able to offset it, take it offline. I think all those things are very important when you're talking to a vendor about implementing any type of large language model into your ecosystem. Uh,
Mhm. I think there's so many costs to AI. It is not a cheap endeavor. It's not a cheap technology. And so one of the tools that we put together again as part of this study is just a brief to encourage folks to think about the hidden costs of AI. And not just the costs that are often included in budgets, like the number of licenses or the implementation fee that a vendor might apply, or your cybersecurity insurance, things like that, but also some of the more like nuanced points around how are you updating your training as these technologies change, the institutional change management aspects, which often are grossly underestimated in these types of major efforts at the institutional level. How these tools do or do not integrate with your existing systems, and then the talent retention and upskilling. An interesting conversation for another day, but folks who are getting exposed to these tools are learning a massive amount and in a field that is really in demand. So I'll be curious to see if we have any retention issues, given that in higher ed, we often um, pay less than other industries. And if folks are learning how to navigate this really complicated moment, I think we might have a new angle on the talent pipeline for our own staff that we need to consider. But that's a conversation for a future day. We want to leave you with a bit of a reflection. I know we have just 5 minutes left about your collective agency at institutions, access-oriented institutions, and encourage you to think about ways that you and your similarly organized institutions can pool resources and also pool agency in your vendor relationships to kind of have a little bit more heft, or throw a little bit more weight around, let's say. For a small community college, it might be difficult to get the attention of a big vendor if a tool isn't delivering or if they're not meeting their deadlines or implementation expectations. But if you are in a consortium of community colleges you have more buying power and more agency. So I want to encourage our listeners and people who've joined today to think about what kinds of formats and structures those take. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be all community colleges together. It could be a region of or a district that's going in together with a system, or a community college and their high school, their regional high schools. So just want to encourage folks to think a little bit outside of the box of how you are approaching your current vendor relationships so that you can have a little bit more power in what can sometimes become a very imbalanced power dynamic, especially once contracts are signed. Norm, do you want to say anything? We have about 1 or 2 minutes on the vendor piece.
Yeah, your vendors are everything. Taking the time to choose wisely is very important,
Yeah.
and doing it by committee is also important. Try not to do anything in a silo by yourself. Make sure that you have the organization go with you. And as Audrey explained on the previous slide, it's so important on the management side that we have alignment, such that folks will actually use the tool once you buy it, and so that it just doesn't sit on the shelf and it's not being utilized. So making sure that there's a use case for it, making sure that you have a coalition that's backing you on that is extremely important. And then lastly, making sure that you vet that vendor, and that you really get some good positive feedback on their response in previous organizations that have purchased their capability, and then also their response times if there are problems or challenges. So I think all that's very important when you're talking about vendor management.
Thanks, Norm. I think we were a little ambitious with how much we tried to pack into today's session. What we want to leave you with today is um, a little bit of some resources to take home. So Daniel is going to drop in the chat maybe just the main link to our AI study website, Daniel, where you can find all of these different tools that we've put together, everything from these kind of thought pieces around the real and hidden costs, the threats and opportunities of AI. We also have a board conversation guide for presidents who are wanting to take a more proactive stance in talking about AI strategy with their boards of trustees rather than kind of waiting for their boards to ask them what's going on. We have that AI adoption prerequisites. And with this, I just want to make a final plug for our upcoming final webinar in this series. We're going to be joined by Dr. Monique Reeves from Austin Community College and Elizabeth Riley from the UNC system. They are both tasked with, and Elizabeth was formerly leading AI at ASU. They're both tasked with leading AI, whatever that means these days. So I think we're going to have a really thought-provoking conversation around what it means to be assigned this responsibility and how do you make sure that there's collective ownership when you bear the weight of this moment, seemingly through your title, and how we sustain this change and institutionalize it beyond an individual. So, Norm, thank you so much for taking the time. Are there any last words that you want to share with the group before we wrap?
Yeah, just keep pushing. There are opportunities everywhere, and just being very deliberate and very structured in your approach always bodes well for an organization that's looking to implement a new technology. So this is different. AI is different, but it's not different from an
Mhm.
institutional standpoint. So being structured and measured in your approach is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, Norm, thank you so much for joining everyone on the webinar. Thanks for sticking with us. Appreciate y'all's time, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.